The first arrow punched through Jack Carter's shoulder before he even saw the girl. The searing pain was brief, sharp, and cutting through the air like a whisper of death. He gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out as he stood, a silent shield between the alien princess and the storm of arrows raining down from above. Her desperate eyes locked with his, wide with disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend why a human, why he, would take this risk for her. He didn't know the answer himself. The only thing he knew was that, in this moment, it didn't matter. There was only the girl in front of him, her strange, glowing skin shimmering in the setting sun, and the arrows that kept coming, one after another, each one narrowly missing their mark. They had been running for hours, slipping through dense forests and across barren fields, barely staying ahead of the pursuit. Her name was Liara, and she was no ordinary alien. But to Jack, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that she needed him, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he couldn't let her down. He stepped forward as another arrow whistled toward him, raising his arm instinctively. The sharp sting of the second impact wasn't enough to make him falter. He gripped his rifle tighter, his blood running hot, the fire of determination burning in his chest. He didn't know who was chasing her or why, but he knew the only way out was through. With every step, the distance between them and the danger grew shorter. He moved quickly, silently, his mind racing with thoughts of escape, of safety, of a place where the arrows wouldn't follow. Liara's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling, though not from fear. Her kind had evolved to endure unimaginable hardships, but even they had their limits. Jack could see that she was at hers, and so was he. His armor was no match for the relentless barrage. His injuries were mounting, the pain beginning to blur his thoughts. But still he moved. They rounded a corner of the jagged stone cliff ahead, finding a brief moment of cover. Jack pressed her into the small crevice, holding his breath as he listened for the sound of pursuit. The forest was eerily quiet now, save for their labored breathing. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with something that might have been gratitude, or maybe disbelief. He wiped the blood from his brow and grinned, though it felt like the smile might be his last. "You're safe, for now," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. She didn't respond at first, her expression unreadable, until she gently reached out, touching his face with the lightest of gestures. He had saved her life, but it wasn't until that moment that he realized just how much more was at stake. The arrows had stopped for now, but they both knew the worst was yet to come. Jack took a shallow breath, his chest tightening as the blood from his shoulder wound soaked into his shirt. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the soft whisper of the wind and the rustling leaves around them. The danger hadn't passed. He knew it wasn't over yet. The pursuit was relentless, and his strength was fading, but he couldn't let her down. Liara was beside him, her eyes still wide with disbelief, her body trembling not from the cold, but from the shock of what had just happened. She had never known someone like him, someone willing to stand in front of certain death to protect her. Jack could see the confusion in her eyes. She was used to the power of her people, the strength that came with being an Aurelian princess. Yet here she was, relying on a human, a simple soldier, to keep her alive. He couldn't help but notice how her skin seemed to glow in the low light, the shimmering blue of her features contrasting against the shadows of the cave. Her race, the Aurelians, were known for their resilience, their strength in battle, and their unmatched beauty. But in this moment, she was vulnerable, and he would not let anyone take that from her. They stayed in the small crevice for what felt like hours, the silence of the forest pressing in around them. Jack's mind raced, piecing together their next move. They couldn't stay here much longer. The pursuit would find them soon enough. Liara shifted beside him, her eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. She was still shaken, but her mind seemed to be catching up to the situation. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this? You barely know me." Jack turned to face her, his expression calm despite the pain. "Because no one should face this alone," he said, his voice steady but low. "And because I couldn't just leave you to die." She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand the words, the meaning behind them. "But you're human," she said, the words laced with disbelief. "You're kind, you're not warriors. You're not like us." Jack chuckled softly, though it came out strained. "You're wrong about that," he replied. Humans aren't about being warriors. We're about doing what's right, no matter the cost. The words hung in the air between them, a heavy truth that neither of them could ignore. Liara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the distant sound of engines hummed in the air. The thudding of hovercrafts reverberated through the forest. They were coming. We need to move. Now, Jack said urgently. Without another word, he helped Liara to her feet, the strength in her body surprising him. She wasn't weak, not by any means. Together, they made their way through the forest, their steps careful and quiet. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. He could feel the presence of danger closing in, the scent of ozone in the air as the hovercrafts neared. But he wasn't going to let them catch her. Not now. Not when they were so close to escaping. They broke through the tree-line, and the sight of the open valley ahead filled Jack with a sense of fleeting hope. It was a risk, but it was their only option. Stay close, Jack instructed, keeping his voice low but firm. Liara nodded, her gaze fixed ahead as they sprinted toward the distant ridge. Jack's mind worked overtime, calculating their route, trying to find a way out of this trap. He could hear the engines growing louder, the pursuit closing in fast. They were almost there. They just needed to reach the ridge before they were caught. Jack could feel his legs burning with exhaustion, but he refused to slow down. He had made a promise, and he was going to keep it. The ridge was just within reach when a loud crack sounded behind them. Jack whipped around, his instincts kicking in. There, on the horizon, a fleet of hovercrafts appeared, their silhouettes dark against the fading light of the day. The danger was right on their heels. Jack's heart skipped a beat, but he refused to let fear take over. This was the moment of truth. They would either escape, or they would fight. And Jack Carter wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight. The fleet of hovercrafts loomed on the horizon, their engines whining like a predator closing in on its prey. Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, his mind racing with options. But the only thing he knew for certain was that they couldn't stop now. The ridge was just a few hundred yards away, but the hovercrafts were fast, and they would be on them in seconds. Keep moving, Jack shouted, pushing Liara forward as they ran. Her breathing was ragged, but she kept pace, her eyes scanning the darkening sky for any sign of hope. They reached the ridge just as the first hovercraft came into view, its powerful engines cutting through the air, casting a long shadow over the land. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his legs burning with the effort, but he knew they had to make it to the top. The top of the ridge would give them the height they needed to escape. The steep incline was treacherous, loose rocks and sharp edges threatening to send them tumbling. But Jack kept his grip on Liara's arm, pulling her up with every step. She was strong, but she wasn't used to this kind of physical strain. Jack's eyes never left the horizon, watching as the pursuit grew closer. The hovercrafts were faster than they were, and the distance between them was shrinking with every passing second. He could see the glow of their weapons now, the threat unmistakable. Liara stumbled, her foot catching on a rock, but Jack was there in an instant, steadying her. We're almost there, he said, his voice tight with exertion. She nodded, but there was no time for words now. They reached the top of the ridge, panting and exhausted, their legs trembling from the effort. The world below them stretched out in a vast expanse of desert and wilderness, but it wasn't the view that held their attention. It was the sound, the unmistakable roar of hovercrafts closing in. Jack glanced at Liara, his mind working quickly. They were out of options. The fleet was too close. But then, in the distance, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement, a glint of metal. There! Jack pointed, his voice full of urgency. Liara's eyes followed his gaze, and she saw it too. A small, hidden outpost, half buried in the rocks. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. We go there, Jack said, starting to move toward the outpost. Liara hesitated for only a moment before following, her determination matching his. They ran again, this time with renewed purpose, heading straight for the shelter that might offer them a brief respite. The hovercrafts were almost upon them, their engines screaming as they closed the gap. Jack's breath was ragged, his body screaming for rest, but he couldn't stop now. They had to reach the outpost before the craft caught up with them. The terrain grew rougher as they neared the outpost, the rocks becoming more uneven, but Jack never slowed. He could see the entrance now, a narrow opening in the rock face, just wide enough for them to slip through. The sound of the hovercrafts grew louder, the roar of their engines deafening as they chased them to the very edge of the ridge. Jack pushed harder, his lungs burning, his legs shaking, but he couldn't stop. He reached the entrance first, pulling Liara through just as the first hovercraft swooped down behind them. The entrance was narrow, and Jack barely managed to squeeze through, his chest scraping against the rough stone. He turned, grabbing Liara's hand and pulling her into the darkened interior. They both collapsed inside, gasping for breath, their bodies covered in sweat and dirt. Jack listened intently, waiting for the sound of the hovercrafts to pass. The minutes felt like hours, each second stretching longer than the last, but finally, the sound of the engines faded. The pursuit had stopped, at least for now. Jack leaned against the wall of the outpost, his chest heaving with each breath. He could feel the blood still trickling from his shoulder, but the adrenaline was starting to wear off. "We're safe," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Liara was silent beside him, her eyes staring into the darkness. She had survived, but for how long? Jack didn't know. All he knew was that they had a chance now, a slim one, but it was enough to give him hope. For the first time since this chase began, Jack allowed himself to close his eyes and breathe. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had made it this far. And that was enough for now. The silence in the outpost was heavy, the kind that wraps around you and makes every breath feel too loud. Jack could hear the distant hum of the hovercraft's engines, but it was faint now, as though they had passed, as though the danger had receded into the night. He leaned against the cool stone wall, his heart pounding in his chest, but the adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He glanced over at Liara, who sat opposite him, her body slumped against the wall. She had not said a word since they had taken refuge in the small, dark space, and Jack couldn't blame her. She was a princess, a leader, and yet in this moment, she seemed so fragile. Her skin, that shimmering blue he had come to recognize as a symbol of strength, now looked dull, the glow dimmed by exhaustion. She had been through so much, more than he could ever understand, and yet here she was, still alive, still breathing. For a moment, Jack allowed himself to look at her, really look at her, and wonder just how many people in her life had seen her like this. Vulnerable, desperate. She caught his gaze, her golden eyes meeting his, and for the first time, he saw something there, something that wasn't just the shock of being saved. It was a flicker of understanding. "You're injured," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Jack didn't answer right away. His shoulder was throbbing, his whole body aching, but he wasn't about to complain. "I'm fine," he said at last, though his voice betrayed the weariness he felt. "We're safe for now." Liara didn't look convinced. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice carrying a depth of emotion that Jack wasn't prepared for. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to drag you into this." Jack shook his head, forcing a small smile. "You didn't drag me into anything," he replied. "I chose this. I chose to help you." The words hung between them, unspoken, but they seemed to settle the tension in the room, if only for a moment. Liara looked down at her hands, tracing the lines of her skin as though trying to ground herself. She had never been the one to need help. She had never been the one to rely on anyone. Her people were strong, warriors by nature. They didn't show weakness. And yet, here she was, dependent on a human who had no reason to care about her, except for the fact that she needed him. Jack couldn't even begin to understand the weight of her world, but he was starting to see it, starting to realize just how much she had sacrificed, and how much she had yet to lose. He stood slowly, his knees creaking as he pushed himself to his feet. "We need to move again," he said, though his voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. "We can't stay here for long. They'll come back." Liara nodded, pushing herself up with a strength Jack hadn't expected. She was a princess, but she was also a survivor. Jack could see that now, in the way she held herself, the way she didn't let the fear show even though it was clear she was terrified. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice steady, but there was a faint tremor underneath. Jack looked around the outpost, his eyes scanning the walls for any sign of escape. It wasn't much, but there was a small passage at the far end of the cavern, barely wide enough for one person to slip through at a time. It wasn't an ideal escape route, but it was their only chance. "That way." he said, nodding toward the passage. Liara followed his gaze, her sharp eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. She didn't question him. She didn't need to. They had no time for doubts. "Let's go," she said, moving toward the passage with a grace that belied the tension in the air. Jack followed, his hand brushing against the rough stone of the walls as he made his way toward the narrow opening. Every step felt heavy, like the ground beneath him was sinking with the weight of their situation, but he kept moving. They had no other choice. Liara was right about one thing: they couldn't stay here. Not when the hovercrafts could return at any moment. The small passage was tight, the walls pressing in on them as they crawled through, but they made it to the other side without incident. Jack exhaled, the fresh air hitting his lungs like a shock of cold water. It was still dark, but they were out of the outpost. They had made it. For now. Jack turned to look at Liara, who was already standing, her eyes scanning the area ahead. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice firm. Jack nodded, his determination rising again. They weren't safe yet, but they were one step closer to freedom. And that was all they needed. The night air was cooler now, the sharp edges of the rocky terrain cutting through the stillness as Jack and Liara made their way further into the wilderness. They had traveled for hours, each step taking them farther from the safety of the outpost. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, watching for any sign of movement, any hint of the hovercraft's return. Liara was still close behind him, her footsteps almost silent as she moved, her focus entirely on the path ahead. Jack had learned quickly that she was no stranger to danger. Despite the circumstances, she had not once asked for his help, not once shown weakness. She was a princess, yes, but more than that, she was a survivor. Jack glanced at her over his shoulder, noting the way her hair, shimmering silver, caught the pale light of the moon. She looked every bit the regal figure, the leader of her people, but in this moment, she was just like him. A person trying to escape. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Liara's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. Jack didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He could hear the hum of engines in the distance, just barely audible against the quiet of the night. They were out there, and they wouldn't stop. The question wasn't whether they would follow. It was how much longer they could outrun them. "They'll come," Jack said, his voice low. "But we need to keep moving." Liara nodded, her eyes narrowing as she glanced toward the rocky ridge ahead. They had been moving along the base of a cliff for some time now, but Jack knew they had to get higher. The elevation would give them a better vantage point, a chance to see where they were going and to spot any potential threats. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. "There's a narrow pass up ahead," Jack said, pointing to the ridge. "It's our best shot at getting out of here. We should make it before dawn." Liara didn't hesitate. She was already moving toward the pass, her pace quickening as she pushed forward. Jack followed closely behind, his mind racing with possibilities. The pass was steep and narrow, but if they could make it to the top, they would have a chance. The question was whether they could get there before the hovercrafts did. As they climbed, the sound of the engines grew louder, echoing off the walls of the canyon. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, the urgency of the moment settling in. He could feel the strain in his legs, the weight of their situation pressing down on him with every step. But there was no turning back. They couldn't stop now. The pass was within reach, just a few more feet, but the sound of the hovercrafts grew louder, the light from their searchlights cutting through the darkness. They had to make it, and fast. "Liara," Jack called, his voice sharp. "We're almost there." She glanced back at him, her face determined. Without a word, she pushed forward, her hand reaching for the edge of the narrow opening. Jack followed closely behind, his heart racing as they scrambled up the final stretch. They made it to the top just as the first of the hovercrafts rounded the corner below them, their searchlights scanning the rocks for any sign of movement. Jack exhaled sharply, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked out over the expanse before them, an open valley stretching far into the distance. It was quiet now, but he knew it wouldn't last. They had to get farther, and fast. "We need to keep moving," Jack said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. Liara didn't argue. She was already moving, her steps quick and purposeful as she led the way. Jack followed, glancing over his shoulder once more to see if the hovercrafts were still behind them. The searchlights were still cutting through the night, but they were too far now. They had a chance, but only if they kept going. The valley stretched before them, a vast emptiness that seemed to go on forever. Jack knew they couldn't stop until they found shelter, until they were sure they were safe. There's a small settlement a few miles east, Jack said after a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. We'll rest there for the night, get a plan together. Liara nodded, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. Lead the way, she said simply. Jack's mind was already working, calculating their next move, but for the first time since they started this journey, he allowed himself to relax, just a little. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had made it this far. And that, he knew, was enough for now. The settlement lay ahead, a small cluster of buildings barely visible under the dim light of the rising moon. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of desert dust and the faint smell of wood smoke. Jack slowed his pace, keeping a steady rhythm, his eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of movement. They had made it this far, but the night was still young, and the dangers were far from over. Liara walked beside him, her pace just as steady, her head held high despite the exhaustion that showed in the subtle way her shoulders slumped. They were close now, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was still lurking, just out of sight. They had taken every precaution, but he knew how quickly things could change. He glanced over at her, noting the quiet determination in her eyes. She was holding up well, but there was something different in the way she moved now. Something that told him she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting. For the first time, Jack realized just how much this had cost her, how much it was costing them both. We're almost there, Jack said, his voice breaking the silence. Liara didn't respond immediately, but her eyes flicked to him briefly, acknowledging his words without speaking. They had been through a lot together in a short time, but the real battle was just beginning. As they neared the edge of the settlement, Jack's sharp eyes caught sight of the small figures moving in the shadows, barely visible against the backdrop of the worn-down buildings. They weren't alone. Stay close, Jack said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Liara nodded, her steps barely making a sound as she stayed at his side. They moved quickly now, slipping into the settlement like shadows themselves. Jack's mind raced as he tried to figure out their next move. The settlement was their temporary refuge, but it was still a risk. They couldn't stay long. The moment they stopped, they would be vulnerable. They reached the entrance to a small inn at the heart of the settlement, its door hanging slightly ajar. Jack pushed it open cautiously, glancing around to make sure they weren't followed. Inside, the dim light from a single lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and stale beer. A man sat at the counter, nursing a drink, his eyes glazed with exhaustion. When he saw Jack and Liara, his gaze shifted, but he said nothing. Jack stepped inside, his boots heavy on the floorboards. We need shelter for the night, Jack said, his voice low but firm. The man didn't respond right away, just studied them with a wary look. Jack knew the type, people who had seen too much to trust strangers. Finally, the man nodded. I've got a room in the back. You'll stay until morning, then you leave. No trouble. Jack nodded in agreement, his eyes briefly meeting Liara's. She didn't need to speak for him to understand. They couldn't afford trouble. The man led them to a small, dimly lit room in the back of the inn, barely big enough for a bed and a table. The walls were cracked, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and age. But it was shelter. It was enough. Jack closed the door behind them and turned to Liara. She was already sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes distant, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn fabric of her clothes. Jack sat down across from her, his body aching, his muscles still tight from the hours of running. He felt the weight of his injuries, his shoulder, the bruises on his legs, the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. But he pushed it all aside. They had a chance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive the night. We're safe for now, Jack said, though the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. Liara didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had learned to survive by now, and she knew better than anyone that safety was temporary. It was always temporary. They would sleep for a few hours, but by morning, they would have to move again. Jack knew that, and so did she. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with more danger than they could predict, but they had each other now. And that, for the moment, was enough. Liara finally spoke, her voice soft but resolute. Tomorrow, we find a way to end this, she said, her gaze steady as it met his. Jack didn't doubt her. They would find a way. They had to. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Jack allowed himself to close his eyes, knowing that even if it was only for a few hours, they were safe. For now, Jack woke to the soft glow of early morning light filtering through the cracks in the room's single window. His body ached, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, but it wasn't the pain that kept him awake. It was the quiet, the deep, unsettling quiet that seemed to have settled over them, as though the world outside had paused, holding its breath. Liara was already up, standing near the small table, her eyes focused on something Jack couldn't see. She hadn't said a word, but he could feel the tension in her posture. She was ready, always ready, even when they were safe, if only for a moment. He sat up slowly, his muscles protesting as he moved, and rubbed his eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice hoarse from the hours of sleep that had hardly been restful. Liara didn't turn to face him right away. Her eyes were locked on something far beyond the walls of the inn, as though she could see the future unfolding, and it wasn't a future that offered much hope. "We can't stay here much longer," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. Jack nodded. He had known that even before she spoke. They couldn't afford to linger in any one place for too long, not with the hovercrafts still searching, not with the danger growing closer every minute. "I know," he replied, pushing himself to his feet. His shoulders still hurt, the blood from last night's injury a stark reminder of how close they had come to being caught. But he wasn't going to let it stop him. They had to keep moving, and that meant leaving this small, temporary refuge behind. They gathered what little they had, just the basics for survival. Liara moved with purpose, her every movement deliberate and efficient. She had grown up in a world where leadership was everything, and even now, in the face of all they had endured, she was still a princess, still a leader. Jack admired that about her, the strength she carried even when everything around her seemed to crumble. As they left the inn, the morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The settlement was quiet now, but Jack knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They couldn't risk being seen. He kept his head down, moving quickly but quietly, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. They needed to blend in, to disappear. Liara stayed close, her gaze sharp and alert. There was a sense of urgency in the way she moved now, the same urgency Jack felt deep in his gut. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. As they reached the edge of the settlement, Jack paused, his eyes sweeping the horizon. In the distance, he could see the faint outlines of the hovercrafts, their engines still humming low, just beyond the reach of the settlement. They hadn't spotted them yet. That was good, but it wouldn't be long before they did. "That way," Jack said, pointing toward a narrow path that led into the hills. "We'll follow the ridgeline. It'll give us the height we need to stay out of sight." Liara nodded and fell into step beside him. The path was steep and rocky, the earth beneath their boots loose and uneven, but they kept moving. The sun was fully up now, the light bright and unforgiving, but they didn't stop. Every step took them farther from the settlement, farther from the safety they had just found. Jack's thoughts raced, trying to map out their next move, but he knew that for now, all they could do was keep going. They had to stay one step ahead. The climb was difficult, the steep incline forcing them to pause every now and then to catch their breath, but they didn't complain. There was no time for that. As they reached the top of the ridge, Jack stopped and looked out across the landscape. The world stretched out before them, barren and empty, save for the occasional cluster of rocks or scrub brush. It was a desolate place, but it offered them what they needed, cover. "We'll follow this ridge for a few miles," Jack said, his voice steady. "Then we'll find shelter. A place to rest, to figure out what comes next." Liara didn't argue. She simply nodded, her gaze shifting to the horizon. "We have to move fast," she said. Jack looked at her, seeing the same determination in her eyes that he had seen since the first moment they met. She wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. And neither was he. They started moving again, the weight of the journey pressing down on them. But neither of them faltered. They had come this far, and no matter what, they would keep going. They would survive, and they would find a way to end this. Together. The path along the ridge was winding, and the higher they climbed, the more the landscape seemed to open up before them. Jack's legs were burning with the effort, but he didn't slow. Every step was one closer to safety. Liara kept pace beside him, her face expressionless, but Jack could see the subtle signs of weariness in her movements. It wasn't the physical exhaustion that affected her, it was the constant weight of their situation, the uncertainty, the fear of what lay ahead. Jack felt it too, but he refused to show it. They had made it this far. They just had to keep going. The sun was high in the sky now, the heat growing oppressive as it beat down on them, but they didn't stop. The silence of the wilderness was deafening, the occasional rustle of wind in the sparse trees the only sound that filled the air. They hadn't seen any signs of life for hours, but Jack knew better than to let his guard down. The danger was still out there, hidden somewhere just beyond the horizon. How much farther? Liara asked, her voice breaking the quiet. Jack glanced over at her, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings as if she were searching for something, anything. A few miles, he said, though he wasn't sure. The terrain was unfamiliar, and the map he had was only a rough estimate. They were venturing into unknown territory, and every step took them further from everything they had known. Liara nodded, though her eyes betrayed her thoughts. Jack could see that the uncertainty was wearing on her too. They had no plan, no clear way out of the situation they had found themselves in. But they had each other. That was something. For a while, neither of them spoke, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the rocky ground. Jack kept moving forward, his mind focused on the horizon. They needed to find shelter soon, but the question was where. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long, not with the hovercrafts still searching for them, and the last thing they needed was to be trapped in the open. There's a cave up ahead, Jack said, spotting a dark shape in the distance. It looked like a natural formation, a small opening in the side of the ridge. It was their best bet for now. We can rest there for a bit. Liara's gaze followed his, and she nodded. Without a word, she picked up her pace, moving toward the cave with the same purposefulness that had carried her through every obstacle they had faced so far. Jack followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. They couldn't afford to be careless now. As they reached the cave, Jack glanced inside. It was dark, but there was enough room for both of them to shelter. He stepped inside first, checking the space for any signs of danger. It was clear. For the moment, they were safe. Liara followed him in, her movements swift and graceful, but Jack could see the tension still in her shoulders. They were both on edge, both aware that this moment of calm could be fleeting. Jack sat down on a flat rock near the back of the cave, his body aching from the long hours of travel. He looked at Liara, who was standing near the entrance, her eyes still scanning the horizon. He could tell she wasn't ready to relax. They weren't safe yet. We'll stay here for a few hours, Jack said, his voice low. Then we move again. Liara nodded but didn't sit down. Instead, she moved toward the back of the cave, her eyes shifting between Jack and the entrance. She was always alert, always ready for what might come next. Jack couldn't blame her. The silence was deafening, but it was a silence that had become all too familiar in recent days. The only sounds in the cave now were the faint echoes of their breathing, the rustle of clothing, and the distant hum of hovercrafts still searching, still hunting for them. Jack leaned back against the cave wall, his mind racing. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the day after that. They were running out of time, and the weight of that knowledge pressed on him more heavily than anything else. But they were alive. That was something. And as long as they were alive, they had a chance. Liara turned to him after a while, her gaze steady, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll make it, won't we?" she asked, her words tinged with uncertainty. Jack looked up at her, meeting her gaze. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. "We will," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. He could see the faintest flicker of relief in her eyes, though it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The air outside had cooled as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft, amber glow. Jack sat at the entrance of the cave, his eyes scanning the distant landscape, his thoughts moving as quickly as the shifting shadows. The silence had settled again, but it was the kind of silence that made the weight of the world feel even heavier. Liara was sitting further back in the cave, her posture stiff, her mind clearly still at work. Jack knew she was thinking ahead, planning their next move, just as he was. The moments of calm, like the one they were in now, never lasted. Every second was borrowed time. They couldn't afford to rest for too long. His fingers grazed the wound on his shoulder, the dull throb a reminder of how close they had come to being caught. He shifted his position, flexing his stiff muscles, and glanced over at Liara. She was looking at something in the distance, her sharp eyes constantly on alert, even in the safety of the cave. It was a habit she had, one Jack had come to recognize. "We can't stay here much longer," Liara said, her voice breaking the stillness of the night. Jack turned his head, meeting her gaze. Her expression was unreadable, but her tone left no room for debate. "I know," he replied, his voice steady despite the tiredness creeping into his bones. "We'll leave before dawn. We need to keep moving." The words hung in the air between them. Jack could feel the truth of them, the urgency behind every syllable. He didn't want to admit it, but they both knew it. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that someone would find them. They couldn't afford to take that chance. Liara stood, her movements fluid despite the exhaustion evident in her features. She was a warrior at heart, Jack had come to realize, and despite everything she had been through, she was still as determined as ever. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, looking at him now, her expression soft but serious. Jack rubbed the back of his neck, his mind working through the options. They had no allies, no safe place to go. Every direction seemed like a risk. He had thought of this moment, the moment they would have to move again, but the truth was, he didn't know where to go next. They had to keep putting one foot in front of the other, hoping that the next step would take them closer to safety. "We head north," Jack said finally. "There's a forest about 50 miles from here. It's remote. We can hide there for a while." Liara nodded, her gaze still sharp, but she didn't question his plan. She was used to taking orders, and in this moment, she trusted him. That meant more to Jack than he cared to admit. They gathered their things quickly, preparing to leave as the first light of dawn began to touch the sky. The path ahead would be difficult, but there was no other choice. They had to keep moving. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency as they stepped out of the cave and into the open. The cool morning air bit at his skin, but it was a welcome change from the stifling heat of the desert they had crossed. Liara walked beside him, her eyes scanning the surroundings as they moved through the wilderness. They didn't speak much, the sound of their footsteps on the rocky ground the only noise between them. Jack's thoughts were consumed with the future, with what would happen when they reached the forest. They could hide there, but for how long? It wouldn't be enough. They needed a plan, a real plan, if they were going to survive this. But that was a problem for later. For now, they kept moving. As they walked, Jack glanced at Liara. Her face was set in determination, but there was something else there too. Something that made him wonder just how much she had truly sacrificed to get to this point. She had been running from her past, from her own people, for so long now, and yet she hadn't given up. There was a strength in her that Jack hadn't expected, something that went beyond her royal status, beyond her beauty. She was a survivor, and for the first time since they had started this journey, Jack realized that he wasn't just protecting her. They were in this together. He couldn't do it alone, and neither could she. "We'll make it," Jack said, more to himself than to her. Liara turned to him, her golden eyes meeting his with an unreadable expression. "We will," she replied quietly, her voice carrying a certainty that Jack found strangely comforting. For a moment, the weight of their situation seemed to lighten. They still had a long way to go, but at least they weren't alone in it anymore. They had each other. And that, Jack thought, was enough to keep them going for now.